downtown, and Larry's a resident of the downtown and the north end over here, and we keep populating the downtown with county buildings, so I don't know if that's very sustainable. It probably isn't, but nevertheless, it's a pleasure to be here. And Larry said I've only been county administrator now for 23 years, and so sooner or later, I'm hanging the job. So we're making progress. The one thing that a lot of people don't really get or understand is how much or if county government is involved in sustainable practices or even the things that you're talking about today. And very often easily overlooked. Unfortunately, we happen to be and have a population in the unincorporated area that now approaches 400,000 people. And if it was a city, it would be the fourth largest city in Arizona. So while we're a county and we do a lot of things regionally, we also have to do a lot of things locally, particularly in the local development areas and the type of things that you're talking about. In our sustainable practices, a lot of people don't really, when I say put one and one together, but I would venture to say that we perform an activity that is the largest sustainable activity in the region and probably southwest or even the southeast portion of Arizona. And anybody have any idea what that sustainable practice is? Think of water. What do we do with the water? We don't pump it and sell it. We take your sewage and we turn it back into water. That's a sustainable practice. And so what our wastewater agency does is take about 70,000 acre-feet of sewage a year, treat it to all of the appropriate standards, and if we could sell it back to you as drinkable water. But we don't. We discharge it to the river. Somebody lets it percolate into the groundwater. They take it out a few feet down the river, and it's now magically reappeared as groundwater, not treated wastewater. So that's a sustainable practice. And that sustainable practice, if you were to talk about market rate, and again, sustainability and economics always have to be considered because you can't have a sustainable practice that's not economically sustainable. And if you look at the wastewater example, the market rate on the wholesale level of that 70,000 acre-feet of treated new renewable water every year is at $500 an acre-foot, is about $35 million a year. So we're producing a product that has an economic value of at least $35 million. If you're to take all that water and run it through a water meter and sell it to you at your house, it's probably worth about $1,500 an acre-feet. So all of a sudden that $35 million turns into over $100 million. So that's an example of a very large regional sustainable practice, and it's something that people don't like to talk about a lot. We talk a lot about water and where we get water and treat water, but nobody talks about that sustainable source of water, which is recycled wastewater. The other thing that you'll probably talk about and do in some of your sustainable practices deal with harvesting rainwater. Harvesting rainwater on a very local scale is a way in which to reduce your water bill, reduce your flows to the wastewater system, and actually save the homeowner money and use a product that comes free from the sky to provide some benefit to you. That particular activity, rainwater harvesting, occurs on a very local level. We implemented a project probably about 10 to 15 years ago now, called the Kino Environmental Restoration Project. And if any of you have ever been there or know about it, it was the region's first floodwater detention basin constructed by the Corps of Engineers, and the county was the sponsor in probably the mid-60s to 70s. Very conventional flood control. At that time, the idea of stormwater detention was to basically dig a hole, put an outlet to it, put a barbed wire fence around it, put some razor wire on top, keep everybody out, and it worked. Well, it took all the flood flows and rainwater from Davis Mountain, detain those, put them in an outlet controlled discharge that was, quote, sustainable from a flooding perspective. In other words, it would not flood the downstream property owners. Well, what that did was, it was a nice flood control project, but that's all it was. So about 15 years ago, between the county, flood control district, and the Corps of Engineers, we invested $10 to $12 million in renewing that project and making it the largest single urban stormwater harvesting project in the Southwest. It regularly captures anywhere from 300 to 500 acre-feet of stormwater, puts it in a lake, and then pumps it out of the lake, adds a little bit of chlorine to it to counteract the bird poop effect, and then we put it on the grass out there at those regional recreational facilities, baseball facilities, softball, and soccer. So that's an example of a sustainable practice because our Keno Sports Complex folks are always praying for rain. Because the more rain they get, the less they have to pay in the water bill that our friends in Tucson water. And so that's an example of a very large-scale sustainable project, and that deals with flood control, stormwater. It's a rainwater harvesting to the nth power. If we then kind of go from that to another area of conservation that the county's been involved in, and these are all going from very large-scale regional down to local levels that you're probably talking about, is an area of what we call land conservation. We have a department in the county called Sustainability and Conservation. Well, they kind of go together because what you need to sustain, you also need to conserve. And our conservation effort dealt with the Sonora Desert, the whole issue of sustaining an ecosystem in the Sonora Desert that was appropriate for the survival of every species that occurs naturally within the Sonora Desert, and to avoid the chaos that always occurs from an endangered species listing. Many of you probably, some of you are old enough to remember all of the fights and arguments that occurred over the pygmy owl in this region 15, 20 years ago. Well, it was all because of a listing of an owl that now has been unlisted. And so the community went through absolute chaos with regard to development. What could occur, what couldn't occur, what were the economic consequences of it, what were the ways in which you could mitigate that development. Well, what we said is we really need to take a larger focus on this issue. And yes, we can have one species become extinct over time or endangered in all of the lands and regulations subject to federal requirements of the Endangered Species Act. But there's got to be a better way, and that better way is to basically anticipate every future species that could become listed as threatened or endangered and adopt a conservation strategy that prevents that from happening. And so that's now called the Sonora Desert Conservation Plan. A plan that is implementable over a period of decades. It's now probably close to getting into its second decade of implementation. It's already spent about $170 to $180 million of public voter-authorized bonds to preserve and conserve lands that are unique to the Sonora Desert ecosystem. It establishes that framework for which we can, in fact, conserve large patches of land with diverse ecosystems that sustain the entire, what we call, habitat and occupation of species in the Sonora Desert. So another very large-scale conservation effort. And it has its own economic benefits and consequences. If anyone can remember the chaos that occurred from the listing of the pygmy owl, well, the listing of the Sonora Desert tortoise is just around the corner. And hopefully before that happens, Pima County will have an adopted habitat conservation plan that will cover the full range of species, including the Sonora Desert tortoise. So that is another example of large-scale conservation. We, like everybody else, woke up probably 5 years ago, and Larry Lucero has left, so I can No, there he is. I was going to talk about you, Larry. Our electric utilities keep raising the rates. And so again, in an effort to conserve money this time, we said, let's look at this new concept of sustainable solar development. And we now have at all of our wastewater facilities going into place, 1 or more megawatts of solar generation. We have solar on a number of our buildings, and we'll soon have solar panels shading every parking space of every county office along the awful corridor. And so it's, again, an effort to generate electricity, feed it back into the system. We use probably on average about $10 million a year. That's our electric bill. And so the idea is let's not only contribute back to reducing carbon monoxide into the atmosphere, but it's also talk about sustainable practices of energy and energy consumption, and take a big approach towards the efforts of sustainable solar generation. So that's another area. So I think when you go from the large scale to the small scale, they're all basically the same. They're just different orders of magnitude. And so what you do at the small scale can in fact result in an order of magnitude of change at the regional scale. And so when you talk about these sustainable land development practices, for every lot or for every acre, you add that to another and another and another, and pretty soon you have a very significant and large impact, one that can be measured at the regional scale. So that's kind of what I assume you're really focusing on, because there are a lot of different practices. There are no easy answers. There's no right answer typically, and there's no particularly wrong answer. There are proven practices, and there are practices that we've abandoned because we knew we made a mistake. But you ultimately have to make mistakes before you get to the right answer. So that should never defer anyone from actually trying something that is most appropriate. So with that, I just want to thank you.